Hello, I'm Linda Elder. Welcome to this podcast. I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Gerald Nosich. Hello, Gerald.
Hi, Linda. Good to be with you again.
We are coming to you from the Foundation for Critical Thinking, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization in California. You can join our community at criticalthinkingcommunity.org. We are focused in this series on the analysis of reasoning going deeper. When we think of the analysis of reasoning, we also think of the elements of reasoning. So we could say the elements of reasoning going deeper. And that this means we're assuming that you have some beginning knowledge of the elements of reasoning before listening to this podcast or viewing it. But in any case, we're going to, in this session, be focused on questions in reasoning. So we're going to be exploring the element of reasoning, questions, and we're going to burrow into this a bit and see how we can use questions in ways we don't tend to. We can employ questions in deeper ways so that we can think better across the domains of our lives. Mm-hmm. So let's start, if we could, Gerald, with the role of questions in human life. How do you view the role of questions in human life?
Well, I view questions as essential. I could almost say the most essential part of reasoning about life, but I would probably have to take it back. That's too sweeping, but it's at least essential. Questions are what drive our reasoning, and thus and to the extent that reasoning drives our lives, questioning underlies everything. So without questions, there's nothing for me to explore or investigate or think about. I at first have to see it kind of as a question, something to look for. And one thing that seems important to me about that is the difference between having questions explicitly and having questions only implicitly in the back of our minds. So, for instance, when my son Matt was an adolescent, he wanted to learn about how to navigate an airport and get on the right flight and everything like that. And I could have taught him, and in a way I did some of that. But what I asked him to do is to ask himself, so what question should I be asking at any particular moment, right? Mm-hmm. And that helped him a lot because that meant he was formulating the question, asking it, and then finding out answers or partial answers to the questions. So if you just think about going through an airport, you're confronting questions all over the place. Where is my flight? What line do I stand in? How do I get through airport security in the quickest possible way? You're confronting all kinds of questions, but much of the time, those questions are just unarticulated. They're just way inside us. And so we go through kind of on autopilot. And an assumption I make is that by and large, most of the time, the more explicit our questions are, the better. So I see questions as underlying all aspects of our lives. And with reasoning through aspects of our lives, it's very important for the questions to be explicit, articulated, to the extent that I can do that. So.
And by the way, your example of working with your son, focused on working with your son, reminded me of the example of Socrates. And what Socrates, I believe, in part was doing was trying to create methodologies for questioning. Mm-hmm. He was trying to figure out, how do we get to the best answers? Mm-hmm. And it seems to me, I'm Socrates for the moment, it seems to me that the best way to get to the best answers is through the best questions.
Right. Yeah.
And his way of teaching, which was fundamentally through inquiry,
right,
is something that we should really study as teachers, as instructors. Because in other words, imagine a K through 12 school system whose one of their fundamental purposes is to teach students how to ask the kinds of questions you are helping your son learn to ask. As a routine matter of fact. In other words, what we do here is we focus on questions. What we do in the school is we teach you how to ask good questions. We're more concerned about your questions than we are about your answers. Because we want to make sure you know how to ask questions. You know when to ask a given question and when to not ask a given question. So that example of Socrates comes back again and again to me.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said, especially about the teaching part, that one of the things we're doing is teaching students to ask questions. And there are, in my experience, questions fall into a large number of varieties, but here are two. Many times I could get my students to ask questions in the class, like about the discipline or about what we're studying or about what an author means. And there I could focus on what makes it a good question. Like, what's the author's main point is a good question, and what reasons or evidence does the author give to support her main point? Those are also very good questions. They're good questions because they go to the heart of the matter. And that's a lot of what it is I was teaching. But there's a very different sense, quite different sense, I think, of what it means to ask a good question. And I'd say that at the root, what makes something a good question is it's a question I really want to know the answer to. And I have a feeling that at school, a lot of the time, students are asking questions for teachers who promote question asking, are asking questions because they're in that school mode. They're in the questioning mode in class, but that's different from really caring about what the answer to that question is. Yeah, so.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's a lot of, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I want students to be interested in the subjects we're learning about. I can't always control that, and questions often provoke that, but still there are some pro forma questions that students ask.
Well, I want to jump in there because I think you said that their students tend to be asking the questions that they're supposed to be asking, so to speak. But I was wondering whether you could even say that they're asking the questions.
Right.
In other words, they're not really asking the questions in this case. They're actually just answering the questions that have been formulated for them. Indeed. But the important questions that you face in life are not going to be formulated for you. They're going to be formulated by you. And if you're not formulating those important questions, how are you living your life?
Yeah. I think that's exactly right. Something in a way. Similar goes on with teaching. I taught philosophy of the arts, and my students did really well. I'd give them essay questions on their exams, and they would do really well. It'd be very nice reasoning. It took me years to realize that much of the reasoning, the excellent reasoning that I saw in my student answers, it was excellent a lot because it was my own reasoning that they were giving back to me. And I found that if I asked them questions that on an exam, say, that we had not covered in the course, but were like the ones we'd covered in the course, they were often no better at answering those questions once the course was over than at the beginning. In fact, what they did is they reverted back to the way they reasoned about it before they had ever taken the course, that kind of natural, implicit way we have of reasoning. And so the way that relates to what you've just said is I would ask them, okay, so in ethics, I might say, okay, how would a utilitarian view this? And so I'm asking a question about ethics, seemingly, but the question I'm really asking is, would you please repeat back to me what I told you about utilitarianism? I wasn't really asking them to think through utilitarianism. So I had to change the mode.
Well,
Yes.
so the idea here, one of them that I'm getting is that if you are thinking critically, then you're asking good questions and you're asking them yourself, on your own accord. You may have, somebody may have raised the issue with you,
Right.
and they may have given you the idea. But
Right.
if you don't take it up, or let's say when you take up the idea, you take it seriously, you
Mhm.
ask the questions that emerge from that,
Right.
you ask those questions, then you're in a position to pursue the answers to them.
Indeed.
But if you're not generating any questions because you don't know how to generate questions, because
Mhm.
even though you're in a class where you're being asked to generate questions, the
Mhm.
professor is still inadvertently teaching you to follow his ideas because of the patterns that you're bringing, the students are bringing to the setting. That,
Right.
and so it's
Yeah.
it's complex. But
Yeah.
the thing that I want to again stress is that thinking, as you said, is driven by questions. And if I am not generating powerful questions for myself,
Mhm.
then I'm not really in charge of my life.
Right. Yeah.
And,
That's right. Yeah.
right, because then I'm going with the flow. I'm being blown in this or that direction because I'm going with other people's questions, or the
Mhm.
questions that they're for sort of I'm soaking up from them.
Mhm.
And so take a perfect sort of paradigm case of an example, say gang members, they're soaking up ideas from one another. They're asking the same kinds of questions.
Mhm.
They're all willing to stay within that question range,
Mhm.
right? So how do we get up ahead of this other gang? How do we let them know we're boss?
Mhm.
How do we keep people in
Mhm.
the group? Questions like that.
Mhm.
So the question clusters that you're living within are
Mhm.
the question clusters that are guiding the quality of your life. That's another way of saying it. So
Yeah. So can I ask you a personal question? What would you say is a powerful question that that guides your life or has shaped your life that you personally have asked?
that is an interesting question. I think that one of the most significant questions that has guided my life is, how can I do something to help the world
Uh,
become more rational,
uh-huh.
better? But I would have said, before I had the tools of critical thinking, the language, I would have said, how can I contribute to making the world a better place?
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And I have a deep belief that we can be rational
Mhm.
creatures and that
Mhm.
we can solve the problems that we face.
Mhm.
So that, I think, has been a guiding
Ah,
force.
nice. Yeah. Very nice. Yeah. Um,
What would you say?
well, off the top of my head, I'd say I don't have one as deep and all encompassing as yours is, but a question, again, it has to do with age for me. And then the question is, how can I make life for me and my family better? Where I could spell out kind of what better is. Um, and that's a in one sense, that's a question that guided much of my life with my family. But there's another sense in which I didn't ask it until maybe I was 45. That is, it never occurred to me as an explicit question. I'm hoping I did things in that direction, but it helped a great deal for me to ask it explicitly, because now I could apply critical thinking, I could apply creative thinking. I could think of what are some actual ways of doing this that I have not yet considered. What are the implications of doing it this way or that way? So asking it of myself explicitly just opened up all these avenues of my life, many of which were then further questions. Yeah.
So then that's an interesting activity. I think everyone should pause and do that. Just write down a short list of the questions that have mainly guided your life to this point.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what are the questions that are guiding your life right now? into the future.
Yeah.
And so some people don't, I think most people don't think seriously about questions because they don't have the tools to think seriously about questions. And when was the last time somebody on the streets was talking to someone else about questions? I mean, it's just not something that we do in human life. But it is something, it is what Socrates was saying that we do need to do.
Right.
And we need to do it regularly. And I'm going to, if I'm Socrates, I'm going to accost you on the street. I'm going to be doing it to you every time I see you. And so questions have been brushed under the rug in terms of our use of theory of questions to improve human life and the lives that we affect as humans. So we just, as a beginning place, then we can start to think more seriously about just the concept of questions and the role we're giving it in our lives, and whether we're taking command of our questions or whether we're just going along with the questions around us. And as you say, most of these are at the implicit level. And that's another problem, because then we don't really even know the questions that we are being driven by, because it's at the implicit level. So if it's at that level, then we're really in trouble. So we don't have any idea what we're doing here because we don't know what the questions are that we're asking, that we're answering. So that's a good starting place.
Yeah. It's difficult to learn. There's that stepping back move, right? And that reflective move where you step back from the issue that's confronting you, and you ask yourself not about the issue, but you ask yourself, what questions should I be asking about the issue? That stepping back, that reflective step, seems to me to be characteristic of critical thinking, and it's hard to do. I'm not saying that's the only way of thinking well, but it's hard to do. Especially as a daily practice.
Well, I think too, we sometimes we may say, well, I am asking questions. Okay, so let me give you an example. So you're in a romantic relationship, let's say, and you're having some kind of problem, and you ask. So let's say you say, okay, so I saw this video on the importance of asking questions and going deeper. So I'm going to ask this person certain questions, and I'm going to ask them questions about their purpose, and I'm going to ask them questions about the information they're using. So, I'm making some moves like that, but actually, not that those are bad moves. Those are, as it were, reasonable moves in and of themselves, but maybe in context, the question, the main question I should be asking is, should I be even in this relationship?
Oh, right.
You see, so we can't, obviously, we don't want an academic approach to the questions in a way that disconnects it from reality. So in other words, you say, okay, well, I'm going to ask some good questions right now, but maybe you're not even facing the real issue here. So maybe the real question, the most important question is, what is the issue here that I need to face or deal with? And so there, okay, then that brings in the willingness,
right,
intellectual courage,
right,
to face the questions that I need to ask myself.
Right.
Sometimes we're not asking the questions because we can't, as it were, stand the answer, or we fear the answer.
That's right.
Or we don't want to have to deal with something. I just don't want to be bothered. So yeah, it's not the best relationship, but it's better than some, so.
Right. Yeah. About romantic relationships. So there's a section in my second book in which I give an analysis of marriage, like what assumptions are you making, and then I answer them. What are some of the implications and consequences? What's your point of view? Using elements of reasoning. Well, someone at the foundation gave a workshop to elementary school teachers in South Africa, and these were all women, and he had them read that section about questions I can ask about my marriage. And they were just quite taken with those questions. And they went home to their husbands and asked, so what assumptions are you making about our marriage? And the husbands were taken aback by the question, what's your point of view on our marriage? And or a concept. What is your concept of being married? What do you mean by that? And it was just very enlightening. I'm not sure always in a positive way, but but at least initially they were taken aback. But I think they were very good questions. And
so that leads to then some of the critical thinking concepts that we can utilize in, let's say, further understanding the role of questions in thinking. So for example, let's take the elements of reasoning. We can talk about the elements of reasoning and their relationship to questions. We talk about intellectual standards and their relationship to questions, and intellectual virtues and their relationship to questions, and the barriers and their relationship to questions. And then we can take other approaches to questions as well. So just jumping in then with the elements of reasoning. So each of the elements of reasoning lends itself to questions that can be asked based on those elements of reasoning. So could you give us a few examples, Gerald, in any of the elements?
Yeah, so there are 8 elements that we talk about, or 8 categories of elements. Assumptions is one. And so I can always ask, what are my assumptions in this particular situation? I can also ask, what are the assumptions being made by the other person? I don't need to ask them. I can kind of reason it out for myself, maybe imperfectly, but I can ask, are my assumptions valid or invalid, right? I mean, are they well-founded or not? A lot of times people are against assumptions, but of course we make assumptions all the time and they're perfectly okay. So that's assumptions, but the same holds for any of the other elements of reasoning. Like, what information do I have about this situation? And another important question that bears on that is, what information about this situation do I not have, but that I need? Oftentimes the information that I have is much more prominent to me than the information I don't have and haven't quite noticed that I don't have. Something similar holds with regard to interpretation, conclusions. How am I interpreting this situation? That's just a great question, because oftentimes, for most of us, we just look at the world and see it seemingly as it is. I see the situation as it is. I see how my family is responding to me. I see how the students are responding to me. I don't quite realize that seeing that this is the way it is really an interpretation. It's really a conclusion I'm drawing based on, well, in the case of students, looking at their faces as they in class, or how they're talking in small groups. I can see them doing that. Are they talking on the topic? That I may not have such good information about. So seeing the world in terms of, how am I interpreting this? And am I interpreting it accurately and clearly and fairly? Those are good basic questions about the elements of reasoning, in this case, interpretation, conclusion. And they're questions that we don't usually ask, but they open up whole areas of insight into the world around me. Here's a teacher-like example. I will sometimes have a student at the end of a class, 40 students in the class, who will say, it was completely unclear. The whole class was unclear. And I, for many years, I'd just be not heartbroken, but along that path, I'd feel it. Oh my goodness, I was very unclear in class that I didn't convey it. And so think of that. This is one student out of 40 who said something to me, and I'm drawing conclusions inside me based on one student's testimony, one student's response to me. So I began passing out in class a student response, and I'd find out how many students thought it was going too fast, too slow, what was clear, unclear, what was clear and what wasn't clear. And students could fill out this form anonymously, and maybe like 2 or 3 minutes, and then I'd report out. Because not only did I unconsciously take that one student's comment as representative of everyone's, but that student also took his or her interpretation as representative of everyone's. The person didn't just say it was unclear to me, but it was unclear. That is, as if it was unclear to everyone. And so by hearing other students' interpretations, their conclusions, it kind of made a nice corrective effort for me as well as for the students. So I've gone off about interpretations, but
Well, yes.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I was going to just say that. So in the original, when the student first said this to you, your question probably was something like, oh, I wonder how I can do a better job of reaching the students then.
Yeah, right.
You went to that question.
Right.
At an unconscious level, most likely.
Right.
And then you had a little time to think about it. And then you thought, wait a minute, maybe I'm asking the wrong question. This is probably still happening at the unconscious level for you, I'm guessing.
Mm-hmm.
So then you become it starts to become a little more clear, like the move you should make, that would give you the data that you need
to
make that decision. So then the question is transformed to, how can I find out what the students actually do think?
Indeed, yeah. And that's that's a question about accuracy of one of the standards, of course, but oftentimes our exploring of the elements sends us there almost directly. How can I find out if these, I mentioned assumptions, what are the assumptions the other person is making? How can I find out if these are the assumptions the other person is making? Right?
Well, and it's interesting because as I was trying to explain that just now, it was sort of fun because I said I was saying probably at the unconscious level. So that points to the fact that we're, as you said earlier, we're sort of constantly asking questions, or at least routinely. They're mainly at the unconscious level. So imagine being able to step back up from that and see all of that. Right. In other words, so as you go through the day, try to do this. Ask yourself throughout the day, every few seconds, what's my question right now? What is my question right now? What is my question right now? Just to become more aware of the fact that we're asking questions. Right. What is my question right now? What is my question right now? Well, so then that, and we could do that, of course, with the other elements of reasoning as well. And again, just to give a recap very quickly. So the idea that we are focusing on when we talk about the elements of reasoning is that there are 8 elements embedded in all reasoning. We have a purpose. We ask questions, which we're focusing on here. We use information. We make inferences based on that information and based on the assumptions which we're making, which is another element of reasoning. We use concepts to guide our reasoning, which also inform and are interconnected with our assumptions. Right. And those are connected with our point of view, which is another element of reasoning. And all of this leads to implications. And when we act on our behavior, our thinking, we end up with consequences. So basically, we've boiled the elements of reasoning down. Richard Paul did years ago, and then we are continuing the work, boiling this down to the 8 elements. So we're burrowing into these 8 elements. We're focusing on questions right now. And so if we take any of the elements of reasoning, if we take purpose, if we take questions, if we take any of the elements, we can ask questions based on that element. Right. So even questions. So if I'm in the domain of questions in the elements of reasoning, I can say, well, what are some questions we could ask about questions? So one is, what is the question at issue? What is the real question versus what is the question that I think I'm pursuing? Something like that. Right. Right, that's a possibility. Or what are the questions embedded in this question? Or is there a better question for us to be focusing on right now than the one we're focusing on, in fact?
Right, right. Right.
And if you think of like this kind of like a discussion like this, we are, as we move from one topic to another, we're asking a host of questions like, is it time to move on? Have we developed this enough? Do we need more examples here? We're doing that underneath our thinking.
Yeah. Yeah. A thing that's kind of that I ponder a lot is kind of what I consider almost a fact, and that is that people can get along, many people can get along fairly well without knowing even about the elements of reasoning, or without actively pursuing critical thinking. Some people can get along very well with it, as we see by looking at thinkers and great thinkers in history. I mean, they may have considered the elements of reasoning kind of implicitly, but they didn't have them in front of them. So we can get along pretty well without doing it explicitly much of the time. But I always have this very strong sense that we can make our lives and our thinking very much better by asking questions related to the elements of reasoning. So that I might do it okay. I might get along, to use my example earlier, to make my family's life better. I might do that okay without ever explicitly asking myself the question. But as soon as I articulate the question, how can I make my family's life better? Oh, all these roads open up for me that I didn't have before, that I was just, I don't want to say blundering down, but just kind of meandering down these paths without kind of knowing where it is I was going, without asking the question of what lies ahead. So I'm puzzled by that. And I think that's a lot of people's resistance to asking questions. They feel, oftentimes incorrectly, I'm doing okay now without asking many questions. And often they're not doing so well.
Yes, I'm glad you ended with that, because I thought that it was, you opened that up. I felt it was a little misleading, that we can basically get along without explicitly using the tools of critical thinking, or here we're focusing on the elements of reasoning.
Right.
And I don't think of it that way. The way that I think of it is that certainly I agree, we would have to agree that a considerable amount of excellent thinking has been done without explicit knowledge of the theory of critical thinking within every field of study. But those people are the rarities.
Right.
So take literature. So we have the classics. If you think about the classics, even if we stretch the list of agreed upon classics, it's still a pretty small group in comparison to all the publications that have been produced. So these people were thinking critically to some degree, to a high degree, in certain areas, not necessarily in all areas. So take someone like Dickens. Dickens was very good at revealing pathologies in terms of institutions for people. And so that's one example. So he was very good at that, but he wasn't so good at creating the character who's highly rational. We don't really have that example from Dickens. Right. We have a lot of critique, which is very well done. And this is what we tend to see in the literature, the critique, revealing the problems in human societies and human thinking.
Right. And to add to that, just to go on the Dickens part, I think too, yes, he was excellent at revealing the problems in the institutions in late Victorian England, but I don't remember any time when he actually proposed a good, strong way of making things better. His emphasis never seemed to be on that, not in the novels, but as far as I could tell, not in his thinking much either, even outside of the novels. So again, there's a spotty nature to our thinking.
Exactly. Yeah. So we know that there are countless examples of criticality occurring in human life. The question is it enough to sustain us and help us live at a level of self-fulfillment? I mean, for all humans.
Right.
See, we're so far from that reality.
Mm-hmm.
And mostly people or half of the world's population are asking the question, where's my next meal coming from?
Right.
Or will I get health care if I need it? Or do I need to run for my life right now with my whole family and leave everything behind me? I mean, it just, the
Mm-hmm.
wars and all of that. So this means that these people never have a chance at
Right.
the kind of work and the kind of world that we're trying to help create.
Yeah. Yes.
So we can look at any of the elements of reasoning again, and we can ask questions based on those elements. We've given multiple examples of that. We can ask, well, what are the implications I'm facing in this situation if I make this decision?
Mm-hmm.
Throwing in on concepts. What are the key concepts driving my life right now?
Mm-hmm.
What are the key concepts driving my professional life?
Mm-hmm.
What are the key ideas guiding my role as a parent,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
my role as a teacher, my role is in this intimate relationship? What ideas am I bringing into the setting?
Mm-hmm.
And are those ideas reasonable? And does this other person have the same ideas of the same thing, so to speak? Or are we diverging in our ideas?
Mm-hmm.
So there are unlimited numbers of questions we can ask when we understand the elements of reasoning.
Mm-hmm.
And for those who want to go further, we suggest that you look at the Thinker's Guide to Analytic Thinking, and there are multiple resources on the elements of reasoning on our website. So let's move on then to intellectual standards. So intellectual standards are the standards by which thinking is judged by critical thinkers, basically. So if we take the term critical thinking, well, thinking is reasoning in the way that we're conceptualizing thinking right now within this context. And the term critical brings us criteria that we need to adhere to to be thinking at a high level of quality. So some of these intellectual standards, just to name them, are clarity, accuracy, relevance, breadth, depth, logicalness, fairness, sufficiency, and there are many others. These are some that we begin with. Justifiability. So we can take any of these intellectual standards and we can ask questions based on these standards as well.
Right.
So can you give a few examples of that, Gerald?
Yeah. One thing that I find quite striking is the way that asking the question about the standards can make us think in a really quite different way. So if I just ask you an ordinary question like, how did you spend the last 3-4 hours? And I ask you, just tell me about it. And so you tell me about it. Now I say exactly the same question, but I insert one of the standards. I say, tell me what you did in the last 3 or 4 hours, but be as accurate as possible. That to me, if somebody asks it that way, it puts me in an entirely different frame of mind about how to answer what I've done in the last 3 or 4 hours. The last 3 or 4 hours under the first question, I just casually give you my answers. Once you say, be as accurate as you can, accuracy being the standard, I now think, okay, well, how about this? Well, no, that generates all these questions. Something similar happens if I take the standard of precision. So I ask you, so be as precise as possible about what happened in the last 4 hours. You see that when people get in an automobile accident, they have to fill out this form, or the police officer asks them what happened, or what exactly happened, and you have to fill out the form in writing or online so that it's actual words, not just casual talking, and you got to be extraordinarily precise. Well, the person hit the left side of my car. And then I ask you the front, the door, the rear on the left-hand side. So describe your last 4 hours, but be as precise as possible. It changes my whole way of thinking about it. So that's, I think, true for all the standards. And there's this great thing about the standards too, that we can, if we're adroit about them, you can do it in casual conversation, and it makes it very much richer. So imagine you're sitting around the table, Thanksgiving, all your family members and friends are around, and someone starts making a point, and you can ask, well, here's a clarity question. Can you give me an example of that? It's not confrontational. It's not putting them on the spot. It's not saying, I disagree and you're wrong. Can you give me an example of that? Or about precision, can you give me some of the details of that? Or sufficiency. So do you think that's a full answer, or is it only a partial answer to the political problems you've been talking about?
Mhm.
And each of those sends us to a different frame of mind, and I think changes the way we answer to a great degree. So the standards are an excellent place to begin questioning.
Yes, yes. I was thinking of your first example. Tell us what you've done in the last 3 or 4 hours, something like that. And you added first the standard of accuracy and then precision. So accuracy means get it right, make sure every part of it's right. Precision means give us a lot of the detail, all of the details, or some of the details are right. We were not clear about how many details the person wants.
Right.
But then I was actually thinking, when you started adding standards, I was going to immediately add the standard of significance.
Right, right.
Well, if I had said, tell me what you've done the last 4 hours, Gerald, I mean, what you've done of significance.
Right, that's right. I breathed in, I breathed out, I breathed in, I breathed out. That would not be an appropriate answer, because it's unimportant given the question.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or you could say to someone, now, what have you been reading lately? And they say, I've been reading the local newspaper. Okay, so what have you been reading of significance?
Right.
And that forces the person to say, well, maybe nothing.
Right.
And maybe I need to go and grab a book by Seneca. Or, I mean, so what are you reading of significance? And actually, it's a good example. It was maybe a Freudian slip, because Seneca said, read only the best works and read them again and again. So that he believed that. So the standards are almost always needed as we move through the day.
Right.
And so if I am preparing for, let's say, a talk, then there are certain things that I need to do in order to perform at a certain level, at a high level, in my view, based on my knowledge. And so I've got to ask certain questions, like, am I focusing on the most significant points I could make?
Right.
What are the most significant points? Often I'm dealing with concepts. I'll ask, what is this concept? If I'm dealing with the concept of creative thinking, I might ask, what is creative thinking? So I might go to the dictionary and look up the word creative first. And so then I connect that to the word thinking and show people how the two work together. So in other words, what are the concepts driving this talk? What examples am I going to use?
Right.
And so what I'm saying is that the intellectual standards, as you said before, when you talked about the elements of reasoning, we are often adhering to intellectual standards, right, without realizing it, when we don't have explicit awareness of intellectual standards. So there are many people who are clear, accurate, relevant, broad, deep, and etc. within certain domains of thought, maybe their field of study,
right,
for example, and they're doing this intuitively. They may not be able to tell us why they're making this move or what move they're making, but they are adhering to these intellectual standards. And so the question is then not, do we ever adhere to them? Because we must, or we wouldn't be alive. I mean, you must sometimes be clear, accurate, relevant, and so forth, or you just be a basket case. So everybody sometimes, or frequently, or somewhere in between, adheres to intellectual standards. So the question becomes, how can we make our adherence more explicit? So in other words, if I'm preparing for a talk, so just based on this little example that I gave, if I'm preparing a talk, the next time I do, I may stop and say, remember that conversation you had with Gerald in that podcast? So you said you take a little time and you really formulate your questions. Now, you know, you're asking these are good moves. These are coming to you intuitively, Linda, but what is not coming to you intuitively? What other questions could be asked? And so based on intellectual standards, or for that matter, the elements, and they go hand in hand, as we know.
Yeah, and for me, the standards, two of the standards tend to fall into a separate category for me, and those are the standards of depth and breadth, in that oftentimes clear, accurate, and relevant, and as precise as necessary come to me fairly straightforwardly, but depth and breadth generate a different variety of questions for me often. Now, depth can mean a lot of different things, but one of the main ways we use it is, what are some of the complexities? What are some of the complications of this? So if I take even many ordinary questions and I step back from the question, a problem I'm having in my life, say, and I ask, okay, so what are some of the complexities of this situation? That question opens up avenues that I'd never thought about before, right? Many people have strong political views, and they're come on very strong on this side or on that side, just full force, and I do that sometimes as well. But then I ask, what are some of the complexities of the situation? Well, that makes me have a much more refined and intellectual, and engage in much more intellectual humility as I try to answer the question. And something is similar with breadth. How can I look at this from different points of view? Because we all tend to be strongly embedded in our own point of view. And when I ask, how are other people looking at this? Or how are other reasonable people looking at this? Or even if I think the person's view is unreasonable, how many people, unreasonable in this case, how many otherwise reasonable people are viewing it another way, and how do they see it? That can open things up for me in a major way. Depth and breadth lead, well, obviously, deeper and more broadly.
On breadth, that's an interesting move that you made there, and it made me think about when we think about point of view, we tend to think about entering other reasonable points of view that we may be not considering. And one thing that I do to expand my own breadth, I guess, of knowledge, is I try to read in the works of and biographies of distinguished thinkers.
Right.
People who have accomplished at a high level, and how do they think about life, and how do they think about things, and what are their habits? What are their intellectual habits, so to speak? And that looking at exemplars for thinking, I think, is a very important phenomenon that we should engage in much more of as humans, because we tend to look at the masses and how they're behaving. I mean, look at TV, look at movies. You rarely see portraits of the rational person. See, even in classic works, again, like in Dickens' books, you see a lot of the dark side well illuminated. But what about the bright side well illuminated? So, for example, take a biography or the autobiography of Nelson Mandela. The autobiography of Nelson Mandela is exemplary because in it, you can see lots of examples of critical thinking, although Mandela's not using the term critical thinking, but he's making a lot of the moves explicitly. And he's saying we had this information, but we lacked that information. So it's an example. But we also see a considerable amount of intellectual humility in him, because he also brings in mistakes that they made in thinking, that he made in thinking, arrogance, that they, the fact that they ever got caught was really their fault. They weren't thinking well when they were caught and then sent to prison. It was that was the most unwise thing that I think they did.
Yeah.
But he illuminates how they got caught and how they became careless. For example.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that about him, but I was in another podcast recently in which someone asked me who in history would I say is a critical thinker, and I backed away from the question because I said, well, with all human beings, there are parts of their lives where they think critically, and there are parts of their lives where they don't. And if I name anyone, people will find numerous examples of how they haven't been critical thinkers, or didn't live up to their ideals. I just recently read something about Gandhi, whom I have immense respect for, about how his son, when Gandhi was younger, but his son was around 20, so Gandhi must have been 40 at least, maybe 50. His son wanted to marry a Muslim woman, and the son was a Hindu, and Gandhi absolutely forbade this and said that this is going to ruin India if his son does it. And his son listened to him and broke off the engagement. And I thought, wow, that's so inconsistent with what Gandhi stood for. So if I bring up Gandhi as a paragon, or even as a partial paragon, someone else on another side can key in on the deficiencies. So I always shy away from that.
Yeah, so let me add to that. That's a very good point, and one that we really need to fully understand. And so if we ever name an exemplar, we mean an exemplar in certain areas that we can see clearly, or we think we can see.
Right.
And in other words, if you can just take the parts where the person excels and learn from those parts, you still have to be able to critique the weaknesses in the person.
Indeed.
So, and this leads us back to the importance of being able to think critically in general terms, so that we can distinguish the two.
Yeah.
So you could say, so somebody might say to me, well, Linda, you're going on and on about Mandela being this great thinker, but what about the fact that he actually, by making all these decisions, he in essence abandoned his family? And there isn't any response that I can make to that that's going to be satisfactory, because he in fact did that, and he in fact did have a responsibility to his children. So and he also raises that point,
right,
and he doesn't really defend himself very well on it. But so what I'm saying is that we've got to be able to look at exemplars and see the exemplary things that they do,
right,
or did, and not say, but we've got to torpedo the whole person, because if we do that, we will have no exemplars.
Right. Social psychologists sometimes call that the halo effect, meaning that if someone is good in some respect that we think that's very important to us, we will halo the rest of them. We'll think that the whole person is good, or moral, or ethical, or thinking strongly. And similarly, there's a halo effect on the other side. If someone is evil or does very bad things, we think that person is evil in all respects. So and yet neither of those seems accurate in fact, but more than that, it's just a oversimplified view of the way humans are. I mean, humans are not this univocal kind of thing, and not only that, but over the course of their life, they're clearly not consistent. I mean, what I thought of as an adolescent is very
well, you mean we have to go all the way back to all those decisions and average it all in? That's not. So okay, so then we are all imperfectly adhering to intellectual standards. That is, sometimes we're clear, sometimes we're not, sometimes we're accurate, sometimes we're not, sometimes we're giving enough detail, sometimes we're not, sometimes we're thinking within other points of view that are relevant, sometimes we're not. So then again, it comes back to us, to each one of us, to be responsible for telling the truth to ourselves
Right.
about the degree to which we are adhering to these intellectual standards. And this is all related to questions, because if we're adhering to these intellectual standards, we're asking questions related to those standards, though they may be implicit.
Right. Yeah, and it brings me to a kind of gripe I have. There are people around who say you can't teach critical thinking. You can't teach critical thinking. And I had actually somebody who was a provost at a major university say that to me. Well, of course you can't teach critical people to be critical thinkers. And what bothers me about it is that it's as if they see critical thinking as this single thing, which you either have or don't have. So the question is not quite, can you teach people to be critical thinkers, but can you teach students, say, to think more critically than they do now, to more often raise questions,
Beautiful.
more often ask about their assumptions or the implications and consequences? And the answer to that seems clearly and obviously yes, and eminently testable in a straightforward way. Again, it goes with this idea of everything fitting together, all the parts of us as humans being a single thing. That seems to be completely unrealistic.
Yes, and when we look at the literature on mental health, mental well-being, and therapeutic approaches that work, what we increasingly are seeing, even in the research, is that critical thinking leads to lower levels of depression, for example. And that doesn't mean in every single person, in every single case, but it means that when people, for example, and this makes obvious sense when you say it, when people make poor life decisions and negative implications follow, depression often follows as well. So if we can reverse those decisions or make better decisions to begin with, which would even be better, then we can have, we make better life decisions and we'll be less likely to be depressed.
Right.
And so this is, in other words, and in any given person may not, now I'm thinking about the continuum of learning. So, or you can going up the ladder, any one of us may not make it from one side, a very poor thinker, to the best thinker in the world. We're probably not going to.
Right.
But what if we made it halfway? In other words, what if we improve a considerable degree? So you're very much more often you're accurate, very much more often you are logical.
Right.
And in any case, critical thinking has never been given a chance.
That's right.
It's never been utilized in an extensive, long-term way, to my knowledge, really anywhere, so that we could then say we've actually tried critical thinking and we know that it doesn't work. We haven't actually tried it. So not on a grand scale, and not routinely, and not using this rich toolbox that we have in the Paulian school of thought. So we could talk more about intellectual standards, but I think for anyone who's interested in going further, remember we have a Thinker's Guide to Intellectual Standards, and you can sit down and write out each word, each intellectual standards word, and then ask yourself, what questions could you ask if you understood that concept, that standard? Right. And the same would be true for the elements of reasoning. If I understand purpose and reasoning, then what are some questions I can ask based on purpose? If I understand significance in reasoning, then what are questions I can ask based on significance? Am I asking the most significant questions in my life right now?
Right, right.
For example. So those are two categories of concepts that we focused on in relationship to questions. Now let's move for a few minutes, if we could, to questions we can ask when we are taking seriously intellectual virtues. And so if I could, now I'm reading from How to Study and Learn, the Thinker's Guide for Students on How to Study and Learn a Discipline.
Okay.
So let me just give a couple of examples. So let's say I want to develop intellectual humility. Intellectual humility, as we know, means that we can accurately and do accurately distinguish between what we know and what we do not know in a given situation. And we are very happy to admit what we don't know, assuming that no one is going to harm us by admission. But in any case, we are willing to admit the limits of our knowledge. And we're happy, and you can hear when you listen to good scholars in a field, no matter what the question is that they're being asked, they don't ever answer any other way than they know how to answer it. And that is, they don't, well, when the person's trying to get them to say more than they know, they never do that. They just say, well, we don't really know the answer to that yet. That's maybe unsatisfactory, but I can't say for sure.
Right.
They don't say what they think when they don't know what the truth is.
Right.
And so you can really learn from people that have that kind of intellectual humility. So this is one of the intellectual virtues. And of course, there are others. And just to name them very briefly, the ones that we tend to focus on in our cluster, our core cluster: intellectual courage, intellectual empathy, intellectual integrity, intellectual perseverance, confidence in reason, and intellectual autonomy. And we can add intellectual discipline, intellectual responsibility, intellectual curiosity. So let's just take intellectual humility again. So we can ask questions like this when we're trying to develop intellectual humility in ourselves. What do I really know? So that's sort of like Descartes, what do I really know? But then you could say, what do I really know about myself? Now, imagine, okay, so that's your assignment for today. Write the answer to the question, what do I really know about myself? And then you can say about sort of anything, about the situation, about this other person, about my nation, about what is going on in the world. What do I really know versus what do I think I know?
Yeah, a couple of the questions you raised there just strike me about intellectual humility. I don't want to say intellectual humility is my favorite of the traits, that there's something kind of ridiculous about saying that, and my favorite changes from moment to moment, but maybe intellectual humility is one I inclined to from when I was very young, that I inclined to in a very strong way, maybe more than to the others, but I just get often impressed with how much I don't know, even about the things that I know the most about. Someone here's not one I know a lot about, but I was asked on a podcast having to do with the military, did I see he said the disaster in Afghanistan as a critical thinking error, and I said, I really can't answer. I just don't know the information that the decision makers had in front of them when they made the decisions they made. And I don't know the assumptions they were making at the time. All I get is stuff from social media or from the newspapers or from some sources, which are not the decision makers. And I don't even know how many decision makers there were and whether they all agreed with all these aspects of it. And so there's a way in which I can't really give you an answer about the disaster in Afghanistan, but maybe I'll be able to find out in 30 years or so when historians have access to these documents. So it's a variety of I don't know, even if I have strong views about what happened in Afghanistan. And again, this is something I mentioned earlier in an earlier podcast of ours. One of the reasons we think it was a failure of critical thinking is that it was so disastrous, but that's outcome. That's different from reasoning it through well or not ahead of time, in that if it had turned out well, we'd have said, oh, we reasoned it through well, even with exactly the same reasoning if the Taliban had acted in a different way, say. So the way things turn out, well or badly, disastrously or fabulously, is one indicator of how well I've thought it through, but it's only one indicator. Success or failure depends on a lot more factors than that. So yeah, I strongly incline toward the questions prompted by intellectual humility. Richard, I remember I gave a keynote, and Richard was really pleased because I said how much I liked finding out I was wrong about things. And I really do. I just enjoy that tremendously. Something I believed for a very long time, and then I find out that's not true at all. And it just opens things up for me. I think, oh my goodness, that's wonderful. Yeah.
Well, I'm wanting to burrow into your example a bit, but I think it's the example of Afghanistan is a tough example because there were such human costs involved. And we can't, from our perspective, know what moves the decision makers were actually, in fact, making. We don't know that. So we do know that certain things could have been done better to save more lives. And in any case, even if it, and once that had been done, let's just say the consequences would have still been horrible for everyone else. So in other words, there wasn't a way to get everyone out of the country, but the United States government did have responsibility to certain people. And so we can take the example apart, we can examine, and I think we can critique parts of what happened with even with intellectual humility.
Right. Yeah. For me, it hinges a lot on how much of those outcomes, or the likelihood of those outcomes, were reasonable to know ahead of time, right? Not after the fact, of course, we see it. Yeah. So, and that I just don't know, but I haven't kept up with the literature on the disaster in Afghanistan either. So
and I think that we did know, and we could have done a much better job. And again, I think you can bring intellectual humility into the situation and still know certain things.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
On the face of them, they seem obvious. And then in some cases, you could even then be wrong. But your other point about enjoying changing your mind, you see, this is a very rare trait. Very few people are happy to say, oh, yes, I've believed this for 20 years. Thank you for telling me that I've been wrong all those years. Appreciate that. You see, that because we tend to connect our identities to our ideas, which we should not do. So I'm a person of value in and of myself because I am a person, and yet I have certain responsibilities to think as well as I can. And when I have an idea that's wrong, if it's not connected to my identity, then I can go, oh yeah, okay, so you've given me another way of thinking about this.
Right.
It's great. I'm so glad, because actually now that I think about it, these 20 years I've been using these other ideas, they haven't really been serving me very well.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes it's not so much finding out that I was wrong as going back to breadth. And that is, if I take about during COVID-19, wearing a mask, being vaccinated, getting a booster, I'm strongly in favor of all three of those. And I think those are, I don't want to say completely correct, but overall much more correct than not wearing a mask or not getting vaccinated or not getting the booster. But when I began thinking to myself, how how do those people who haven't done any one of those three things and are against those three things, how are they thinking about it? It didn't get me to change my mind, but it got me to explore the ways in which I could, at least seemingly reasonably, see how, well, it's not reasonable. I'm not saying this is me. This is the point of view I'm thinking through. It's really not reasonable for me to believe the CDC, the government with respect to these three. And look at the changing information they're giving us. Now, to me, that changing information is very positive. It means they're dealing with uncertainty and they're giving us the best answer they can at any time. But if I don't pay attention to that, I can think, well, sometimes they're saying wear a mask. Sometimes they're saying not wear a mask. Sometimes they're saying cleanse all surfaces, and then other times they're saying you don't have to do anything about the surfaces. So they're just all confused. I'm not going to believe them. I'm shortchanging it, but I can put myself in a position where I can see, I even have analogs of those in my own thinking about things that the government has done. So it didn't cause me to change my mind, but it caused me to see another point of view with more intellectual empathy than I had originally, to use another word.
Right. And of course, there are different reasons why people would refuse a vaccination.
Right.
And the point that you made about let's say the way the government has behaved and the way that people think about the government and that we can't trust our government. See, the government in a way gets what they deserve. In other words, our government has through the years done many things that were underhand and were not in the interest of the people, either here or internationally. And there are a lot of people then that don't trust the government.
Right.
And that it makes sense that they don't, based on the real evidence that you can read, which would show you why you shouldn't trust the government. But this question of the vaccination is a question that is fundamentally a scientific one, not a political one. In fact, it's not a political question at all. It's a scientific question.
Right.
And now you could say, and the scientists don't necessarily agree. And they've also misled us a few times. And within, they came out with one vaccination, which actually resulted in certain blood clotting in people that were quite young, and then they died in its early phases. Well, now we know this, and now the people coming behind them are not going to die most likely because they know what's happening. It's a certain kind of blood clot, and they know how to go in and fix it. So what I'm saying is that, and what people don't have to realize is that we're living through a plague that we in a situation that humans have really never lived through exactly in this form. And there are parallels going back in history now almost 100 years. But most of the people living now were not aware of, were not alive then. So what I'm saying is this is directly related to the subject of questions, because what people are doing is they're making the wrong move by saying, well, why should I go along with the government? They make that move, they're showing that they don't know what kind of question we're dealing with here. And then, even though it's a scientific question, we realize that the scientists are not necessarily going to agree, especially because we're in early days of the vaccination. And so even when you trust, let's say, the scientists, because you have to trust something here, and it is a scientific question, even though you trust the scientists, it doesn't mean you necessarily would want to be the first person vaccinated. That is right. And I myself would not. And I said early on, I will be vaccinated after millions have been vaccinated. Now, maybe that is a view that lacks courage, and certainly it's true. But that's what I'm saying is I'm saying we can't just follow scientists because they say something is true. We
Right.
follow the data that hopefully has been gathered objectively. And when it comes to something like a vaccination, which is going to be very powerful, it makes sense to me to
Right.
make sure there's enough data for me personally to say that I'm comfortable with that decision.
Right. Well, and though you're completely right that the question of the effectiveness of the vaccine or of a booster is a scientific question, it gets complicated by the fact that the government is the one that tells us what the scientists are saying.
Yes,
So
yes.
I have to listen. So if I listen to the CDC, I'm not exactly listening to the scientists. I'm listening to those who report to me what scientists have said. And with other government agencies, what the EPA says depends on who gets appointed as head of the EPA by this particular administration. So the guidelines that the EPA, scientific guidelines that the EPA puts out, change from one administration to the next because of political considerations. So there's that intermediary that the government often plays in relating the scientific findings to me. I can maybe get around that by, as someone suggested in a Q&A webinar I gave just a few days ago, by going to the experts myself and reading the scientific journals. But that's a huge enterprise. And second of all, I'm not that confident that I will come to a better interpretation than the CDC comes to reading those same scientific journals. So it gets complicated.
It is complicated, but in the end, we as thinkers need to be able to distinguish between a political and a scientific question and any other kind of question.
Absolutely.
And when it's a scientific question, we need to know we've got to rely on the scientists who know the most about this particular issue.
Yes.
Yeah. And that is that those scientists may come to us through the CDC or some other website, and they may not. But basically, when we see these scientists agreeing across the world, and they're saying the same things, then that's going to be more powerful to me than when we see disagreement. Right. And then we can see them making all kinds of mistakes as well. And this adds to the problem. For example, early on in this pandemic, remember we weren't supposed to wear a mask? And unless you had something. Right. And to me, it was never logical that we shouldn't wear a mask. Right. And then a few months later, it was suddenly the scientists saying everyone needs to wear a mask. Well, that doesn't help their credibility. Right. So often scientists are making statements when they themselves are not fully informed, but they're behaving as if they were. Instead of saying, we think this is true, we're not sure yet. This is the best we can do. We are not sure. And in that case, they should have erred on the side of more masks, but they erred on the other side. Right. So all of these are important for people. All of these complexities are important when we think about how to pursue questions. Yeah, and I was actually maybe at least emphasizing, maybe emphasizing intellectual empathy of how people who would be opposed to vaccinations, why they might do it. I wanted to make the most reasonable case from their point of view I could. But in fact, my belief is that many people just pick up their data, such as it is, about the effectiveness of the vaccine by looking on social media, by talking to their friends, by sitting around in a coffee shop and hearing what other people have to say. So we pick it up in this kind of piecemeal way from unreliable sources, and we then act on that. And that seems to me to be a much more accurate reconstruction for at least why many, at least some of the people, oppose vaccinations. Well, we are beginning to get into one of the intellectual virtues on intellectual humility. You started by saying this is a unique trait, and in a way it is. because if you don't have a considerable amount of intellectual humility, then you really can't develop much as a critical thinker, because the opposite of intellectual humility is intellectual arrogance.
Right.
So if you're never asking questions, and I'll just read a few others that we can ask when we're trying to embody intellectual humility. To what extent do my prejudices or biases influence my thinking? Or you could say, probably a better question, to what extent are my prejudices or biases influencing my thinking right now about X? And to what extent have I been indoctrinated into beliefs that may be false? Well, that's a very difficult question to answer. But if you say, to what extent have I been indoctrinated, let's just say, into beliefs by groups that I've been thrust into? So I could start with, I was thrust into my family, and then I was thrust into maybe a religious group, but I was thrust into a school district, the system. And so how might I have been indoctrinated in these, through these groups early on? And it is, even that is going to be difficult to do.
Right. And you say thrust into, whereas a much more hard-hitting term for me is born into. So I'm born into my family. I can be born into my religious or political or cultural group, and those have a very deep-seated effect on us, right? Because maybe during the first 12, 15 years of my life, that's really all I know is my culture, is my family, is my religion, is my political views, the ones I get from my family. And so to grow out of that, to emerge on the other side, takes a considerable amount of intellectual humility. And that to me takes a great amount of time. And intellectual humility, I think maybe of all the virtues, is the one that most directly leads to questions. So I ask myself, of these structures that I've been born into, what do I not know about my family? Right? I mean, you grow up thinking your parents are always right, that they know all the answers, and soon it becomes very obvious that they didn't. But I could ask myself that question. I'm not saying to ask it when you're 6 years old, but ask it sometime during your life. Yeah.
But it's hard when those are at the level of assumptions now.
Indeed.
So that's why these questions are, they make sense, and we can see the power in them, but how do you get at these beliefs that you or have uncritically accepted?
Right.
So that we tend to find in a context when we start to develop our thinking, and we are committed to developing our thinking, and let's say in a situation I find myself prejudging or something, then I can stop and say, wait a minute, where is that coming from? And that may lead me back, hopefully, to that false or that unreasonable assumption.
Yeah, a question I ask my students often when we worked on intellectual humility was, so the opening question is a take-home assignment. What are some things that you believed 5 years ago that now you think are wrong, incorrect, or off center or misleading or something like that? And my students could readily write down a whole bunch of them. I was in love with so-and-so and thought it would last forever. And so huge numbers of them. So then they do that, and they find that very enlightening. But then the next assignment is, what are some things you believe now that you think maybe in 5 years you might come to think are wrong or misleading or off center or throwing you off? And that's a much more profound, deeper kind of activity. And my students seem to get a great deal out of it, because it causes them stepping back into intellectual.
Well, you kind of push them against the wall a bit, because the first part of it seems sort of easy. I mean, it's not easy, but it's easier than what's to come. But you've already done that. So you've proven this, that 5 years later that you've changed some of your thinking. Now you're going to have to prove what you're going to change for the future. Whereas you actually don't want to change anything, because you think everything that you believe is accurate right now.
Right. And I could ask So what are the odds that everything you believe now is going to turn out to be the same? You're going to believe the same 5 years from now. And yeah, so right, yeah, there, yeah.
So we have just begun to scratch the surface of going deeper with questions. I think we should wrap up for today and do our next part two, pick up part two with this continuing discussion on how questions help us develop intellectual virtues, and then focus on other ways of going deeper with questions. So thank you, Gerald.
Thank you, Linda. Wow, wonderful. I've enjoyed this tremendously. Yeah.
It's always a lot of fun, and I'll see you next time.
Okay, good.
Take care, everyone.